Welcome to the Away podcast. This is a bonus episode. Hey guys, it's Steph. It's bedtime. I'm in bed with 3 cats and a dog and a husband. And much to the annoyance of all the creatures in my bed, I'm recording this, and it's not episode 3. We'll call it an extra or a bonus, because I spent a lot of today feeling kind of badly that I was asking my listeners to do so much research on not just the history of AA, but on the history of this country in 1939 or there around the first half of the 20th century. So I wanted to make an apology for that, but I also wanted to give you a little bit of the information that I don't know, I guess I was too lazy to give you, or I think sometimes I forget that I'm so interested in it that everyone else will be. And the intention of this podcast was to hopefully teach a little, I guess, and to guide a little. And I don't think I was being as helpful as I could be. So I wanted to give you just a little bit more of the backstory I referenced, and then a little bit more about the Oxford group, which I think will really help frame the book a little bit more and make a few things clear that may not otherwise be. The story will actually be retold later in the book, as many of the stories are. Repetitiveness is certainly a part of this book, and I think intentional, so that you hear the message over and over and over again, which means it's more likely to become firmly rooted in your mind. But also, I think there's some thoughtfulness to it. When you begin the book, you may be more foggy. Your mind may not be as clear, and as you progress, your mind will clear up, and it may be easier to understand and really hear what the writers were trying to convey. So with that in mind, I just wanted to do a little more of that story we talked about with Bill and Ebby and Roland Hazard, 3 of the names I mentioned. So Roland Hazard was himself an alcoholic and friends with Ebby Thatcher. And he tried various ways to get sober himself and couldn't find any that really worked for him until he finally got to see Carl Jung. And Carl Jung kind of had a hopeless outlook for alcoholics, for bad alcoholics on the whole, and seemed to think that the only way to true and real sobriety was through a spiritual awakening. Now, whether or not he meant spiritual in a supernatural sense, or spiritual as in a change of mind and attitude, I don't think anyone can really say for certain. I choose to think it was the latter. So when he tells that to Roland Hazard thinks, well, I've got church in my life already, I'm all set, and that shouldn't be hard. But Jung emphasizes that it's not so much about religion, it's about a total shift in in the way you think and perceive the world. So Roland, who's friends with Abby, to shorten an otherwise long story, brings this information to Ebby Thatcher. Ebby Thatcher, who too has been trying various means to get and stay sober, accepts the information with excitement, I suppose, and goes in search of his own spiritual awakening. He lands upon, or is a part of, the Oxford group, and it is the Oxford group that helps Ebby to get sober originally, although he doesn't stay sober for his entire story. But it is because he found the Oxford group that he originally got the gift of sobriety. And he meets up with Bill one day at Bill's house. And Bill is sort of skeptical about this happy-looking fella sitting in his kitchen, but decides to listen. And that's important because, as we know, we're not always great listeners when we're drinking. And Ebby tells him a little bit of his story and that he's sober now. And he says it's because he got God. And goes on to explain to Bill more about his experiences with God via the Oxford group. They basically have a long, deep, and philosophical conversation, and Bill really can't get past his anger and fear or disbelief, and Ebby finally throws up his hands in frustration and says, just make it a God of your understanding. And that's where we get that gift of the idea of a God of your understanding, which for the time was a gift, though it may not seem so today. So with that, Bill sort of has a spiritual awakening of sorts of his own. He understands, as do the other writers, some of whom were atheists, not just Jim Burwell, although he's a great one, understands that the rigidity of the Oxford group is part of why it is probably failing. Historically, other groups that were very God-centered and religious had also failed, like the Washingtonians. So I think he and the writers were aware of that as they embarked on their own program, figuring out their own program. That said, I want to read to you a little bit about the Oxford group and its tenets, its 5 C's, because I think you'll notice as I read some of the information the group itself put out and that's been written about it since, if you really listen, you're going to hear a lot of similarities between the Oxford group's tenets and beliefs reflected in the big book. It's partly why I get no longer infuriated, but still annoyed by people who refuse to admit that the program is very Christian, or really don't understand history or haven't bothered to learn it and argue about it, as well as people who use tradition as an argument, period. Just because something is tradition, in my opinion, that doesn't mean it's good. It just means it's been practiced for a long time. There are plenty of traditions that we've evolved past. So I do think it's very important to know about the Oxford group and to keep that in mind. So I am actually very sorry for not being more willing to go into it with you in episodes 1 and 2. So the Oxford Group was a Christian organization founded by American Christian missionary Frank Buckman. He was actually Lutheran. Buckman believed that the root of all problems were the personal problems of fear and selfishness. If you haven't read Forward in the Big Book, that is how the writers also saw the primary problem with alcoholism. Further, Buckman believed that the solution of living with fear and selfishness was to surrender one's life over to God's plan. I think we've heard that before in the steps. I'm sorry about the sniffling. I've had a cold for about a week now. The co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous met through the Oxford Group and codified several of its tenets into AA, the first 12-step program. So the Oxford Group was incredibly influenced by the theology of Keswick Convention at the time, and that was Christian holiness, an idea originally derived from Methodism, of the second work of grace, which would allow entire sanctification. The Oxford Group literature defined the group as not being a religion, for it had no hierarchy, no temples, no endowments, its workers no salaries, no plans, but God's plan. Their endeavor was to lead a spiritual life under God's guidance, and their purpose was to carry their message so others could do the same. When Buckman spoke about the Oxford Group's primary purpose, he said, "The Oxford Group seeks to be living Christianity," something I don't entirely disagree with the concept of, because that's about action. The Oxford Group had 4 absolutes. Moral standards of absolute honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love, though they recognize those as impossible to attain. The 4 absolutes were guidelines to help determine whether a course of action was directed by God. In Oxford terms, sin was anything that kept one from God or one another, and is as contagious as any bodily disease. The soul needs cleansing. The Oxford Group advocated 4 spiritual practices. 1, sharing of our sins and temptations with another, similar to step 5. 2, surrender of our past life, present life, and future life into God's keeping and direction. Steps 2 and 3. 3, restitution to all we have wronged directly or indirectly. 8 and 9. 4, listening for God's guidance and carrying it out. 11 and 12 for us. Sharing in the Oxford Group was considered a necessity. It allowed one to be healed, therefore it was also a blessing to share. Sharing not only brought relief, but honest sharing of sin and victory over sin helped others to openness about themselves. Sharing built trust. This is very much like the idea of one alcoholic talking to another. The message one brings to others by speaking of one's own sins, one's own experiences, the power of God in guiding one's life would bring hope to others that a spiritually changed life gives strength to overcome life's difficulties. The 5 C's and 5 procedures of the Oxford Group. The 5 C's, confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance, were the process of life changing undertaken by the life changer. Confidence, the new person had to have confidence in you and know you would keep his secrets. Confession, honesty about the real state of a person's life. Conviction, the seriousness of his sins and the need to be free of them. Conversion, the process had to be the person's own free will in the decision to surrender to God. Continuance, you were responsible as a life changer to help the new person become all that God wanted him to be. Only God could change a person, and the work of the life changer had to be done under God's direction. For alcoholics, there were 3 autobiographies by Oxford members who were active alcoholics, which were published in the 1930s. These books provided accounts of the alcoholics' failed attempts to make their lives meaningful, until, as a result of their Oxford membership, they found a transformation in their lives and sobriety through surrendering to God. I think you can understand why I see the Oxford group as a really important part of AA's history and as a very strong influencer of the book. Bill was clearly taken by their practices and beliefs, though he also appeared to understand that the rigidity of it would be unpalatable to many people. So again, while he was still unevolved by today's standards, I think he and the other writers of the big book were making an effort to be more progressive, certainly more progressive than many of their peers. That's just a little bit about that history. A lot of people will refer to the Roland Hazard, to Ebby Thatcher, to Bill Wilson, and then as the story continues, when Bill Wilson connects to Dr. Bob and how that happens, is some people say a miracle. I don't agree it was a miracle. So anyway, again, I want to apologize for not being more detailed in the previous 2 episodes, and I very much hope that you'll accept the apology and that you'll stick with me and that I'll stick to my promise of keeping more and more information that's relevant to the story in the podcast as opposed to asking you to look it up. In the meantime, please know, I promise that there is a way.